every place that you go in the Muslim world, we as Muslims generally we all understand as a part of our belief the importance of following and revering and honoring the early generations of Muslims. We know because the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him, has informed us that the best of our community is his generation and the two generations that succeeded him. His generation, the generation that followed him, and the generation that followed them. But throughout the Muslim world, what I found is that people have a healthy respect and a healthy sense of gratitude toward the people who established Islam where they are. In some cases, people who've been Muslim for hundreds of years will actually know who was responsible for bringing Islam to their family, for introducing their ancestors to Islam, or who was responsible for introducing Islam to their tribe, or who was responsible for introducing Islam to their city or their region. When you go to Morocco, people know about Fatima Fihriya, who established the Qaraween, the oldest educational institution in the world, which has been a great center of Islamic learning for centuries. People know in West Africa about Sufi Muhammad, who was a reformer who established an Islamic ruling regime, dynasty of the Songhai Empire, and who was a patron of the city of Timbuktu. People know about the great rulers who helped establish Islam in that part of the world, like the ruler Sindiata. People know something about their history, and not just the people who live in the Middle East, where the folks who established Islam often are folks who were of the first or second or third generation of the Muslims. But throughout the Muslim world, people know about who's responsible for bringing Islam to them, and they have a healthy honor and a healthy respect for those people. And as I hope, when we go through a little bit of the history and then kind of like reflect on what some of the lessons we can learn from this history are, one of the things that I hope people will take away is the importance of understanding that history and having that sense of gratitude, and how many of the issues that we have in our community as Muslims in the West today come from us not knowing that history and not understanding that history, and therefore having a skewed, biased understanding or a skewed and not quite accurate understanding of what it is we need to do. A lot of lessons that we've already learned, we find ourselves sometimes having to learn again, because we don't have an appropriate understanding of the history. And this is from our tradition. We know that part of showing gratitude to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is showing gratitude to His creation, showing gratitude to His servants who have helped us in various ways, whether that's our parents, whether that's our teachers, whether that's the people who have helped us to be able to practice Islam. So I just say that as a sort of introductory comment, and I'm just looking to the side because I have some notes here to help keep me focused and on task. But yeah, so today our focus is going to be on the history of Black American Sunni Muslim communities. And we're focusing on this today. Obviously, that doesn't mean that we want to take anything away from or we want to ignore the aspect of our history that involves the contribution of other groups of Muslims, people who considered themselves Muslims, who had some understanding of Islam, whether they be in the Nation of Islam or the Ahmadiyya community or the Moorish Science Temple. Personally, I feel that it's important for us to know that aspect of the history too. And having a healthy regard and honor and respect for the contributions from those communities doesn't have to take us into a place where we begin to overlook issues of theology or belief or practice. No, we can have a healthy respect for somebody who maybe didn't have the same understanding of Islam that we had, but still put an effort to enable us to be able to identify with Islam and practice Islam unfettered in the time we live in. But we want to focus on the history of Black American Sunni Muslims because it's a history that unfortunately has been largely overlooked. And I personally think that it's our own fault, because people in other communities have done a good job of preserving their history and have prioritized that, whereas African American Sunni Muslim communities sometimes have not. So we're focusing on African American Sunni Muslims, and some of the people that I'm going to mention were people who came out of other movements like the Ahmadiyya community, the Moorish Science Temple, but really I'm looking at folks who began to teach or identify with quote-unquote Sunni Orthodox Islam I like to use the word Orthodox because in the communities I study, this is the terminology that they often use. People will say things like, I became an Orthodox Muslim at such and such time or in such and such year. So people identify with Orthodox Islam or Sunni Islam in the earlier period of the 20th century. So we're talking about the 1930s, 1940s, and I'm only going to cover this history up until roughly 1980, roughly the 1980s, just to kind of put a pin in it, because, like I said, the history is so vast. I thought that would be kind of a fitting stopping point for today. So we're gonna get into it, inshallah, because we don't want to disrespect time. So any history of Islam in America really needs to begin with the history of Islam among enslaved African peoples. In fact, there's some evidence that in travel logs and writings of Arab explorers, as well as in the oral history of West Africa, there's some evidence that there may have been some West African Muslims who actually traveled to the Americas before the transatlantic slave trade, before Columbus arrived in Hispaniola in the Western Hemisphere. And people that I've talked to whose opinions I respect hold that opinion. Even I myself, from looking at the evidence, there's a good bit of evidence to substantiate that, but it's inconclusive. But we know for a fact that there were certainly Muslims in the Americas far before the American Revolution, before America, quote unquote, was an entity. There were Muslims who were brought here as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Some estimates hold maybe about a third of the people of African descent who were brought to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade to have been Muslim. It's very hard to pin down who was Muslim and who wasn't, in part because similar to the way our Muslim community looks here, a person who's Muslim doesn't necessarily have an Arabic name, right? And Muslims have varying degrees of practice, right? Various different approaches to Islam that they may embody. And often we find that the people who enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, they didn't really give a whole lot of respect to people's identities that they had when they were enslaved, right? To who they understood themselves to be on the African continent. Sometimes they did, and they did when they saw a way for it to benefit them. So if they saw that two tribal groups generally didn't get along, they would pit them against each other. Or when they saw that one tribal group tended to have more power in the West African or Central African nation where folks were taken from, then they might put those people in power as a way to maintain some kind of hegemony to keep the slaves in check, right? The enslaved people in check. Or if they saw that giving people a certain degree of religious or cultural freedom was the way to enable a more stable slave system, they would do that. Whereas in times when they felt that the better thing to do, the more advantageous thing to do would be to try to ignore and erase people's histories, they did that. So you have all of the, and sometimes they would say, okay, we don't want slaves from a particular place. We don't want to enslave Africans from this area or that area because they're known to be rebellious. And we find that this was often the depiction that was given to Muslims, West African Muslims, in certain times during the transatlantic slave trade. So I say that as a point to kind of start us off, and this history is important and interesting and connects to the history of Islam in America in several ways. Historians often have noted that we have a hard time sort of drawing a straight line between the West African Muslims and enslaved African Muslim communities that we know were present in the Americas during the antebellum period and immediately following the Civil War, and the communities of Muslims that began to emerge in the 20th century, right? So there's a bit of a gap between roughly maybe 1870s to the early 1900s where we begin to lose accounts of Muslims, meaning we have plenty of accounts of Muslims of African descent in the Western Hemisphere before that time and plenty after that time. But during this space, we don't really find any we don't have a lot of clear records of people practicing Islam during that time, right? There's speculation, there's things we can look at and say, okay, this person might have been a Muslim or may have had some connection to a Muslim identity or a Muslim community. You know, maybe there were people practicing Islam in secret, but we don't have a clear group we can point to at that time period and say these people were Muslim. Now, this has led some people to come and say, you know, that there's no connection between the Islam that emerged during the early 20th century and the Islam that people were practicing before that time in America, right? I personally, as a historian, don't find that narrative to be very compelling, right? Because, you know, one brother who's written about the history of Islam in America, whose work I find very, very valuable, is Michael Gomez, brother at New York University. He wrote a book called Black Crescent. And as a historian, and as an excellent historian, I noticed that, you know, the way he deals with this issue is to say, you know, we don't know what the connection is, but we certainly have to look and take seriously the possibility that there may be one. And here's where I think we might have some benefit. Here's where I think we might be able to find it, right? That's the way he sort of addresses the issue. And as a historian, you know, this seems to me to be a much more reasonable approach. A good friend of mine, a Muslim brother by the name of Will Caldwell, who's currently doing his PhD at Northwestern University, he studies this history as well, and we talk about this often. And inshallah, when he comes out with his work, you know, he'll hopefully help us to connect some of those dots. So we're all anxiously looking forward to what he has to offer. But nonetheless, we know definitively that in the early 20th century, you begin to find an emergence of African Americans in urban spaces. This is during the era of the Great Migration, who are identifying themselves as Muslim. And a number of them are folks who are identifying themselves as what they would call Orthodox Muslims or Sunni Muslims. So I want to sort of start or go from there by looking at sort of the context of the African American Muslim community in the 1920s and the 1930s with regard to sort of where we can look to locate Islam, how we can sort of try to get a sense of what Islam in America looked like or might have looked like in the 1920s and the 1930s. And one of the things that you'll find is that Islam is certainly in the air. We know that in the Marcus Garvey movement, right, active during the earlier part of the 20th century, in urban centers around the country, we know that folks who are part of the Marcus Garvey movement would have had some exposure to Islam. When we look at the writings of Marcus Garvey, we find allusions to Allah. We find, in the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey, in his own book, in his own writings, he issues a sort of challenge to white American Christians and says, essentially, you know, you should start treating us the way your religion says you should treat your fellow Christians, because if not, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is almost a quote. He says, if not, would you rather us turn to Allah, to the God of Africa? So Marcus Garvey referred to Allah as the God of Africa. We know that there were Ahmadiyya missionaries who were active in working with the UNIA. We know that Marcus Garvey's own mentor for a time during his stint in London was Dus Muhammad Ali. And we know that Dus Muhammad Ali was a Sudanese Muslim Pan-Africanist activist who at one time actually traveled to America to work with Marcus Garvey. We have accounts of, in New York City, we have the account of Sufi Abdul Hamid, who was an activist and a labor organizer who came from Chicago I'm having a little bit of time reading my notes, staring at the light. I'm sorry. But he came from Chicago to Harlem in 1932. While in Chicago, the sources suggest that he actually identified himself as a Buddhist. So already he was what we might call a spiritual seeker. And he comes to Harlem, and while in Chicago, he's active in his organizing. He's successful in securing jobs for African American folks. And he comes to, in 1932, he comes to Harlem, and he continues to engage in his labor organizing. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. actually credits him as an influence on his own style of oration. And so he's a fixture in sort of the Harlem black activist community. Some sources even suggest that he was involved in what has been termed the Harlem race riots of the 1930s. I sometimes don't like this terminology for a lot of different reasons, but he's involved in this activism that's happening in the 1930s. And he ends up opening, the sources say that he ends up opening a mosque And he titles this mosque, he calls it the, sorry, I have a real hard time. I'm sorry. The Universal Holy Temple of Tranquility, right? The Universal Holy Temple of Tranquility. But he identifies himself as a Muslim. He takes on the name Sufi Abdul Hamid, and he actually ends up passing away in 1938 in a plane crash, right? But we know from his activism, this is another identification that, another indication rather, lets us know that Islam was sort of in the air in Harlem at that time. You know, we have a lot of documented history of the Moorish Science Temple and the Ahmadiyya movement being active in different spaces at that time. But another Sunni Muslim da'i, caller to Islam, some people use the term missionary, but another Sunni Muslim caller to Islam who actually lived in America from 1904 to 1929 was a man named Sheikh Sadi Majid. Sheikh Sadi Majid was a Sudanese Muslim who spent a brief stint in London before coming to America, and he was engaged in organizing Muslims in Detroit, in New York City, in Buffalo, New York. And some sources even suggest that he may have been an early teacher of another man that we're going to talk about a little bit more extensively, and his name is Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal, right? So put a pin in that. If you're taking notes, you want to take note of this man, Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal. So Sheikh Sadi Majid is again engaged in organizing Muslims and organizing Black American and immigrant, mostly immigrant, but also Black American laborers, right? Another labor organizer. So we're beginning to see a trend where these early Muslim figures are engaged in activism and engaged in a critique or a sort of in efforts to empower working class people, right? Efforts to empower working people to be able to have greater rights, right? They're not sort of cordoned off and saying, okay, we're just Muslims who just want to pray all day and carve out a little space for us as Muslims. No, they're engaged in society, right? So he's active in various urban cities between 1904 and 1929. Also, another figure who we don't know a whole lot about, or certainly I don't know a whole lot about, and the sources don't tell us a lot about him, but I'm always open to somebody sending me a message and saying, I actually have that information you need. But this is a brother by the name of Suleiman Abdul Hamid, who also went by the name Prince Solomon, or Prince the Solomon. What we know about him is that he was active in New Jersey in the 1920s, right? We know he was active. We have some newspaper articles about him working as a Muslim and as a Black Freemason in the 1920s and the 1930s. And I know when some brothers and sisters hear about Freemasons, they get a little jumpy and say, "Whoa, this is well, we don't have nothing to do with it." But the reality is that Black Freemasonry has throughout early African American history, going back through the 1800s, you know, Black Freemasons were very much active in trying to improve the conditions of Black people in America, right? And also, Freemasonic temples provided a space where where Black people could explore religious traditions with a lot more freedom than they would have been able to in you know, white spaces, public spaces, majority Christian spaces, which has led a number of historians to infer that there may have been some folks practicing Islam in secret as members of Freemasonic organizations, and there's a lot of evidence for that, and that I would love to maybe even come back and do a separate talk on that, because that has its own history. But suffice it to say, you know, folks like David Walker were Black Freemasons. Freemasons were actually the people who helped to sponsor Prince Abdurrahman, who was a West African Muslim prince who was enslaved and brought to America as a young man, and who, when he got older, was able to obtain his freedom. And he was able to obtain his freedom in part by going around doing these speaking tours that was sponsored by Prince Hall Freemasons, Black Freemasons. So, and I'm not saying that's to say, you know, everybody, let's all go out and join and become Freemasons. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if we look at the historical record, we see that Black Freemasonry is a part of this context of Black activism and Black religious seeking that Islam emerges out of. And so we have Prince the Solomon, or Suleiman Abdul Hamid, who seems like he may have been a teacher or a mentor, or at least an associate of Noble Jew Ali, right? Maybe an early influence on Noble Jew Ali. Some of this is speculative because some of the sources we still have to unearth. But we know this is another person who was identified as a Muslim, identifying himself as a Muslim, who was known in the religious and activist circles of an urban center, this time in New Jersey, in Newark, New Jersey. So this kind of like sets up the context, right? And out of this context, we find a number of figures emerge in this early period, in the late 1920s and in the 1930s, who are unabashedly, unapologetically identifying themselves with Orthodox Islam, Sunni Islam.